We are now introducing the concepts of fertility. Russell, of a Westerner, in 1959 said, "I am inclined to think that the most important of Western values is the habit of a low birth rate. If this can be spread throughout the world, the rest of what is good in Western life can also be spread. There can be not only prosperity but peace. But if the West continues to monopolize the benefits of low birth rates, war, pestilence, and famine must continue, and our brief emergence from those ancient evils must be swallowed in a new flood of ignorance, destitution, and war." This quotation is a common one to find in demography. I have some issues with it because of its ethnocentric perception, but you will find a lot of the theories and concepts moving forward are based on this idea of the important Western value of having fewer children. You can see here with the total fertility rates of 1950 to 1955, there are definitely blocks of countries that do have a lower fertility rate. In 2010 to 2015, you can see have more countries have decreased to lower fertility rates, and there are even a few that are below replacement value, which we will discuss shortly. This slide, which is full of fertility definitions, is the basis for lecture quiz number 12, as we'll be matching these terms. These are the common words that we use in specifically demographic conversations, and that they don't necessarily mean the same thing in other scholarly discussions. Fertility is the production of a live birth. Fecundity is the physiological capacity to conceive, also known as the reproductive potential. Infertility is the inability to produce a live birth. Parity is the number of children born alive to a woman. Menarche is the onset of menstruation. Menopause is the end of menstruation. Both the menarche, which sometimes is called menarche, and menopause occur on one day. The day of onset, the day of end. The mean age of childbearing, also known as the MAC, is the average age a woman has a child. And interestingly, the peak age of childbearing is the modal age in a population where a woman will have a child. Famously, a Russian woman in the 18th century supposedly gave birth to 69 children only within 27 pregnancies. Here is a group of 69 children that have multiple births. First, we're going to talk about maximum fertility. Assume that female menarche to menopause is specifically ages 15 to 49. Assume that there are 9 months of pregnancies. It is 40 weeks, but the first few weeks are often not detected. 40 weeks is a bit more than 9 months. Assume 18 months of breastfeeding, which should be protective of becoming pregnant again. The result is 1 child every 2.2 years. Therefore, fertility rate is 16 children per woman. This is a theoretical maximum for a population. The term natural fertility refers to the level of reproduction that exists in the absence of deliberate fertility control. Natural fertility is much lower than maximum fertility. In 1981, Dr. Davis, a well-known demographer, said, "The genius of the species has not been to rely on a birth rate so high that it can overcome almost any death rate, no matter how high. The genius of the species is rather to have few offsprings and to invest heavily in their care and training so that the advantages of a cultural adaptation can be realized. Throughout 99% of hominid history, then, fertility was kept as low as it could be, given the current mortality." This is a fancy way of saying that social components of fertility are much greater than the biological components of fertility. Most interestingly, the most famously high fertility society is an agrarian community in the Northeast United States and Canada called the Hutterites. They doubled their population 6 times in 100 years. In 1936, their total fertility rate was 11. We're going to run through some fertility metrics, and you may notice some connections to mortality metrics. The crude birth rate is the number of live births per 1,000 population in a given year. So for the Dominican Republic in 2010, it was 195,000 births for over a total population of 9.8 million times 10,000, which equals 19.8. Like all crude rates, this is only a crude estimate of fertility. Some populations are not exposed to the risk of pregnancy. For example, children typically don't get old. Old people, men don't get pregnant, those kinds of people. It is not good for comparing fertility across populations. This is because of variation in the age distribution that will affect the crude birth rate. As you can see, North America's crude birth rate is 14, whereas West Africa, Southern Africa, and South America are all higher. The general fertility rate is the number of live births per 1,000 women aged 15 to 49 in a given year. So we look back at the Dominican Republic in 2010 and we see there are still 195,000 births, but instead of the entire population, including children and old people and men, instead there are 2.52 million women aged 15 to 49. When you multiply that by 1,000, you get 77. The highlights of the general fertility rate is it relates births to the age and sex group at risk of giving birth. Those would be women aged 15 to 49. More refined than the crude birth rate, but still, honestly, a little crude. A more specific fertility metric is the child-woman ratio. The number of children under age 5 per 1,000 women of childbearing age in a given year is very similar to the general fertility rate, but instead of births, it uses the child population. Then enters the age-specific fertility rate. This is the number of births per year to women of a specific age group, sometimes called a cohort, and it is often written as sub n, capital F, sub x, and it is, again, the births divided by the women age, for example, age 15 to 9, times n. In this case, you'll get a 0.61 age-specific fertility rate. When demographers collect age-specific fertility rates together, it is often called a fertility schedule. You can see here the Italian versus the Dominican Republic's schedules. It represents when people are more likely in a population to have birth. Age-specific fertility, like age-specific mortality, is best for comparisons of fertility behavior across ages. And it's good for comparisons of fertility over time, and it's best for comparisons of fertility across countries and populations. The total fertility rate, which I have referred to often, is the average number of children that will be born to a woman in her reproductive lifetime. It is the sum of all of the age-specific fertility rates. The total fertility rate is a synthetic measure of fertility that is independent of age structure of a population, and therefore it is the best single measure to compare fertility across populations. For example, here is a color-coded total fertility rate, or the children born per woman from 2013 from the CIA's World Factbook, which is an excellent source of data. However, there are more ways that we look at fertility metrics. Again, depending on your research question, you may choose to do something different, such as the gross reproduction rate. This is the average number of daughters that would be born to a woman in her lifetime. Gross reproduction rate is just like total fertility rate, but it counts only daughters and directly measures reproduction, a woman reproducing herself in the next generation by having a daughter. If the reproduction of population is GRR equals 3, then one woman has 3 daughters after one generation, and each of these daughters has 3 more daughters after 2 generations. That is quite a method of population increase. The net reproduction rate is the average number of daughters that would be born to a woman in her lifetime while taking into account her risk of dying. The net reproduction rate takes into account the fact that some women will die before entering or completing their childbearing years. Currently, fertility is really wondering about replacement level fertility. When surviving women have exactly enough daughters to replace themselves in the population, it would be an NRR of 1.0. But when it's TFR, it's 2.1. Survivors have exactly enough people to replace themselves in the population. Remember, the TFR does not include mortality adjustments. The replacement level fertility does not imply that the crude birth rate of population growth would be equal to 0. To make it a bit more clear, let's look at the total fertility rates of the United States from 1917 to 1997. During the Depression, the fertility was very low. And then after the Depression, and all the soldiers came back from war, there was a baby boom, followed immediately by a baby bust. And then there was a teeny tiny echo boom. And you can see that these amounts of babies that were born is directly related to the total fertility rate. One thing, though, about the mean age of childbearing in the United States is this is what it looks like from 1917 to 1997. You may be thinking, whoa, almost 28 years old was the mean age of childbearing in the United States? Why is that? However, the previous slide had the mean age of childbearing in the United States for all births, but the reality is, if you look at just the first births, you'll see that the average age of childbearing of successful first births was actually age 23. And you will notice that the average age of first births has significantly risen since the 1970s. For reasons that we will discuss in class, fertility behaviors focus on women. If a woman never has intercourse, she will never have a baby. A man will never have a baby, no matter what he does. Now we know that only women have babies. Fertility rates vary in space and time. And to understand why, 2 questions must be asked. How do people control fertility? And why do people want to control fertility? Well, how is fertility controlled? As identified by John Bodgaerts in 1978, he divided it into 3 factors of fertility, or 3 phases of fertility: intercourse, conception, and gestation. He postulated that factors affecting exposure to intercourse included formation of unions, the age of entry into intercourse, whether there's permanent celibacy, reproductive periods spent between unions. He also thought about exposure to intercourse within those unions themselves, whether there's voluntary abstinence, involuntary abstinence, and also the rate of coital frequency. He also was very thoughtful about the factors affecting exposure to conception. Involuntary fecundity, or infecundity, he really blamed a lot on breastfeeding, but also use or non-use of contraception. Voluntary fecundity or infecundity are based on medical treatment, such as a vasectomy. And he also thought about factors affecting successful births. Involuntary fetal mortality was known as miscarriages, and voluntary fetal mortality, often called abortions. This table, called the proximate determinants of fertility, The intermediate variables through which social factors influence fertility is a gold standard among Western demographers, which we can investigate. Following that model, the next item we will go over in the next lecture quiz are the 4 main determinants of fertility: age at marriage, use or non-use of contraceptions, incidence of abortion, and involuntary infecundity.